All right, everyone. Welcome back here. And in this module, we are actually going to start getting into our cool season turf grasses. So I think I've got both cool and warm season in this module, but I think we're going to get pretty in depth in this. We'll see how the time runs. So I'm thinking we're probably going to end up splitting it into a couple of sections here. So, anyways, here we go. So let's back it up a sec here. So when we're thinking about the cool season grasses, obviously these are going to be, if you're planning on staying in and around Northeast Ohio, these are going to be the ones that we're primarily concerned with. So we're going to start with these first, just because that's what's in our everyday landscape up here. The cool season grasses, if you remember, these are your C3 grasses. So they just use the traditional citric acid cycle, Calvin cycle for the, carbon fixing in order to make carbohydrate. So we have the C3 and the C4 grasses. The C3 grasses would be the cool season grasses. The C4 grasses would be warm season grasses, which are basically, going to grow in your warmer, more tropical areas, and they cannot survive in a place like Northeast Ohio. So the first grass that we're going to talk about here is perennial ryegrass. Perennial ryegrass is, in the Latin, is Lolium perenne. This is going to be the most common cool season grass that you're going to see in these parts. It has small malformed auricles. So when you look at it, it's not going to be very apparent at all that it even has them. So it can be very difficult to see them. When you see perennial ryegrass in a stand, I mean, in a turf grass stand in a lawn setting, it's relatively, it's not the finest blade of grass out there, but it's going to be bigger than bigger than a fine fescue and probably smaller than a Kentucky blue, or at least similar. So especially if you have a blue rye blended lawn, they're going to be very difficult to distinguish from each other. There's some tricks though. If you know what you're looking for, you can distinguish them. When you're out in a lawn setting, this is where Weeds of the Northeast is going to be real handy, because the first section of that book is entirely dedicated to grasses. So grassy weeds, but also your traditional grass varieties in the Northeast. So this would be your cool season grasses. So that's got a really nice taxonomic key in the front of the book that gets into identifying these grasses. So that's a very helpful tool. In season, I actually keep that book with me all the time. Because, like I said, even for somebody like me that's been doing it for 20 plus years, it's still nice to be able to verify that, or at least be confident that you are indeed looking at what you think you're looking at. So some of these morphological indicators on the perennial ryegrass, again, it does have small malformed auricles. The ligule is short and pointed at the apex, so you can actually see it right here. Again, these auricles, as you see them coming around the collar region here, they're very nondescript. So I would almost say in most cases, especially with a lot of the improved rye varieties, you're probably not even going to see them. But you will see this ligule. It is pointed. The leaf vernation is folded on perennial rye. So this is another thing that makes it a little tricky, because it if you're out in a lawn and you're trying to figure it out, typically you're going to run into, bluegrass, you're going to run into perennial ryegrass, you may run into tall fescue. And so it can, tall fescue you can usually pick out in most circumstances. But, when you're talking about a blue rye lawn, it gets tricky. And you'll see why as we move through this. So the vernation on perennial rye is folded. There's another grass called annual rye that a lot of times we'll use for temporary cover or construction sites, things of that nature. That grass is rolled. So similar characteristics to a perennial rye as far as auricles and ligules and things like that, but it is a rolled vernation. The perennial rye is a folded vernation, and so if you tried to roll that stem in between your fingers, it may not want to, okay, because it's folded versus rolled. So the blade margin is smooth. It doesn't have any teeth or serration on the blade edges. The blade surface has ridges and the underside is smooth and glossy. So this is something that when you're in the lawn setting, this will help you, okay, because the top and bottom of the blade look different. Again, here's the top where you can see the ridges with the veins. All right, very, very pronounced veins on the leaf surface. The bottom of the leaf is smooth and glossy. Okay, so Kentucky bluegrass isn't going to look like this. Tall fescue isn't going to look like this. Again, you can see here, you can almost very faintly pick out in this picture that auricle. You can see it looks deformed. All right, so not like a nice like clasping pointed auricle on it, and there's your ligule right there, very small, and again that ligule is pointed on it. The blade tip is boat shaped, but it's more like it's got a keel shaped blade because it is a folded vernation. Most of your folded grasses are going to have that boat or keel or hull shape to the blade when it comes to a tip, basically coming up like this. It is more pointed on perennial ryegrass, and so that can help you. The blade veins are even across, but it does have that, like I said, that distinctive arched keel shape down the blade. So some grasses will have a prominent mid vein that runs down the center. Most grasses, you're just going to see kind of this even distribution across the blade surface. So the flower is a spike. If you ever saw this, maybe if it was in an unmowed setting, the flower is a spike with alternating spikelets. So you can see how each spikelet alternates off of that stem. The roots are fibrous and it spreads through tillering. So it doesn't have rhizomes or stolons. There is one exception. There is Barenbrug came out with a type of ryegrass a few years ago. They discovered it in one of their test plots, or I think maybe it was North Carolina or Rutgers. I'm not sure which university it was at, where they were doing some NTEP trial plots, and one of the researchers at one of these institutions actually discovered it out there. Noticed it was a little bit different, kind of growing in an area in one of these plots, and so they notified Barenbrug about it because it was in their plot. So somehow this thing, they found this variety that has stolons. It actually grows stolons, and they're not so you have what's either an indeterminate or a determinate stolon. The determinate stolons actually do grow a daughter plant. So, when we talked about the cloning of the plant and how they can generate new plants from either a rhizome or a stolon, this is and it's the only variety of perennial ryegrass that I'm aware of that grows stolons. It's nothing dramatic. It's not, something like a creeping bentgrass or something of that nature, but it does grow stolons, which helps with recovery. So typically we don't use perennial ryes in athletic fields because they just get destroyed, and they're the only way that they can recover or regenerate is by tillering, which is a very slow process. But this one is nice because, again, it does heal a little bit faster. Still not along the lines of like a Kentucky Blue, but nonetheless, it does have stolons. So that it's called they call it regenerating perennial ryegrass, and that comes from Barenbrug. If you ever want to look it up, if you're bored, I sell it to some of my clients. They actually use it for lawns and whatnot. There you go. So it is a C3 cool season grass. So again, using this Calvin cycle, it does not have the Krantz anatomy. It doesn't have that additional pathway. It doesn't have, that capability. So optimal range on your C3 cool season grasses is basically 70 to 80 degrees. That's kind of their sweet spot. So as you would imagine, when we are in springtime and we're in that 70 to 80 degree window, which is usually like mid to late May, this stuff grows like crazy. Okay. And then once we get into the hotter summer weather, it pretty much slows down and goes back to a baseline kind of growth and maintenance, survival mode, so to speak, over the summer until we come back into that period of optimal growing temperatures in the mid to late fall. So usually second to fourth week of September, we'll get a second shot of some growth and recovery on the cool season grasses. So it's native to Northern Europe. For nearly 300 years, it was used primarily as a forage crop in pastures due to its high fertilization demands and poor heat and drought tolerance. It didn't mow well. So when we talk about perennial rye, one of the things that's very interesting about it is if you do not mow it with sharp blades, it shreds. And excuse me. So this is kind of important from a maintenance standpoint, and we'll talk about it again when we get into the maintenance. But let me hit it here for a sec. So if you have dull mower blades, especially on a rotary mower, but it doesn't matter if it's a rotary or a reel mower. If you have dull blades, it kind of bludgeons perennial ryegrass. It's got really, really tough cell walls on those veins. If you remember when you looked at that leaf surface, it's got those kind of prominent veins evenly distributed. So it shreds. If you do not mow it with a sharp blade, it shreds, and that can really make it look ugly. If you look at it from a distance, the lawn can often appear like it's drought damaged, or it gets this kind of frosty, almost like it's got this frosted appearance after it's mowed. And then, over time it yellows out. And if you get in there and look at it, you'll see where it has a pretty decent amount of dieback from the tip because it gets damaged pretty easily when it's mowed. And so for this reason, until they really started developing some improved varieties, they really did not use this in a highly maintained turf setting. So breeding efforts in the 60s and 70s led to significant improvements in the quality and density and color. So it's kind of interesting because we rely on perennial ryegrass so much in the landscape setting today, and we often don't think about the fact that a lot of what we kind of see out there today really didn't come into fruition until the 60s and the 70s. So, and we'll see this with a lot of grasses, but again, keep in mind that in the previous slide that because of that mowing issue, you know, with it shredding, it really wasn't used extensively in the landscape setting until, you know, let's just say over the last, you know, 60 or 70 years is really when it became prominent in the landscape. It produces the least amount of thatch of any cool season grass. And so that is... thatch can be a real problem in the landscape setting, especially with our poor kind of silty clay loam soils that we have. Our soils tend to compact really easily. And if you are a thatchy type grass, it's very easy for you to just want to kind of hang out in your thatch zone. It's the path of least resistance. Thatch isn't a bad thing. It does serve a purpose. It helps to protect the crown. It does help to keep the crown and the soil interface hydrated. You know, it's kind of its own built-in mulch system. It does sequester carbon and act as a carbon sink because it is, you know, again, biomass. You know, but thatch can also cause some problems in a lawn setting. So it, you know, it can harbor disease, it can harbor insects. And again, over time, especially if you have poor soils, compacted soils, the grass will tend to root into, you know, into that thatch versus sending roots down into the soil, especially in an irrigated setting. Which we don't want, because then, you know, the minute that irrigation system doesn't work or the minute it stops raining, that lawn is immediately roached because it literally has no root system and it has no ability to get down to the water. So ryegrass, you know, that's one good thing about perennial rye is if we're concerned about thatch, it doesn't really produce a lot of thatch, and you can kind of see the difference. So this would be this is a picture I found kind of depicting this. This would be like a Kentucky bluegrass versus a perennial rye, and you can see the difference in the textures here between the two. I will tell you in a lawn setting that the perennial rye tends to be pretty similar size. A lot of your Kentucky blues have been improved to the point that that blade texture, that the thickness of that blade is really getting thinner and thinner and thinner. And so, you know, especially with our improved varieties, it can be very, very tough to distinguish between the two of them in a lawn setting. So perennial ryegrass and Kentucky blue, as far as like the texture and the blade width, look very similar. But, you know, anyways, back to this thatch thing. Earthworms love the thatch created by perennial ryegrass. So sometimes when I go out, sometimes every now and then, I'd say probably over the last 20 years, I've probably gotten about 5 or 6 calls where I've had somebody say, you need to come out and look at this lawn or this property. And I'll go out there and for whatever reason, you get out on this lawn and it is covered with earthworm castings. And, you know, earthworms are kind of a good bad. Okay, they do benefit the environment. However, most of the earthworms that we have around here are what we would call a European nightcrawler. They're actually imported. They're invasive. The North American nightcrawlers got pushed further south in the continental United States during the ice ages. So they are moving up this way. They are moving up back in and repopulating these areas as the glaciers receded, but they move very slowly. They only move, I want to say they only move northward about 5 feet per year. So, it might be 5 feet or five yards. I don't remember exactly. I got to look that up. But they don't move very quickly. And so, like I said, when the Ice Age pushed our native earthworm species further south, when the European settlers started coming to the northern part, the Northeast, New England, and when they started to move this way into the Northwest Territory, which is now Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, Wisconsin, Minnesota, there aren't earthworms. And one of the primary food sources of the early settlers obviously would be fish. And especially around the Great Lakes region, we got a lot of fish in the Great Lakes, in the rivers and the streams surrounding the Great Lakes. So, fishing was a decent business, in these parts, and they needed bait, and so what do? They bring their European night crawlers over from Europe and throw them in the ground over here, and then you go out and dig them up and harvest them, and they're very, very prolific. They reproduce very easily. They're very prolific. But they do cause a lot of damage to our landscape settings. They actually can damage in our forest settings, especially. There's been a lot of studies on earthworm populations and the damage that they cause on a lot of the native flora in our wooded areas, and that's a big concern. We're seeing a lot of species in our native woodlands disappearing and becoming endangered because of these European night crawlers. But if we move into the lawn setting, this is where we can also see damage. And I go out to some of these lawns, and the lawns are very bumpy, very uneven. You want to talk about ankle breakers. You go out on one of these lawns and it's like the grass is very bunchy, and then there's a lot of open areas where there's no grass growing, and you'll literally see earthworm mounds, earthworm castings all over the place. And it's a real problem. Unfortunately, there's not a whole lot that can be done. Usually what I do is, you can't really kill them. Nor would you really want to. So what I recommend to people is to go in and reseed with a different grass like Kentucky bluegrass or tall fescue, something like that they're less inclined to love. So, but that's just an interesting side note, because we do have a lot of perennial ryegrass lawns in Northeast Ohio. Again, it's probably the predominant grass that's used. It's the landscaper favorite. It comes up quick. It establishes quick. So you will see a lot of perennial ryegrass, and with it, you may start to run into some earthworm problems. It's commonly used in higher cut lawns and fairways on golf courses. It's not good for high traffic areas or athletic fields. So again, lawns. So a fairway, fairways typically are mowed at, say 1.75 inches. Lawn setting's going to be at least that, usually 2 to 4 inches of height on a home lawn, or, a lawn setting like in a commercial setting. So, you don't want to use this on an athletic field, a football field or a soccer field. I've seen a lot of people do it. I see a lot of 50-50 going in on these, and it's a mistake. This grass will not survive in those kinds of situations. Again, it's a tillering grass. Predominantly, that's the only way that it recovers. And if you kill it, because it doesn't have that thatch layer, that crown is a lot more susceptible to getting damaged by traffic because of that. If you kill that mother plant, it can't produce daughters. So, and in perennial ryegrass, you're killing the mother and the daughters, anything that's basically there, which you're going to have to go back and reseed. You do not want to really use this in any athletic fields or high traffic areas. It's not a good grass for that. It will tolerate being mowed down to about 1.5 inches. So That's about it's not going to go much lower than that. So again, you're not going to use it on greens. You're not going to use it on a tightly mowed athletic field. It's just not going to be a good fit for that situation. But it will hold up just fine against the occasional scalping by the homeowner or the homeowner. So it's also used in the South. So in the Southeast, especially, we do a lot of winter overseeding on Bermuda grass. Bermuda grass will tolerate colder temperatures. So when we think about places like Tennessee, North and South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, northern Florida, where they do get colder winter temperatures, Bermuda grass is a very commonly used grass down there. They are trying to make improvements to it to get it up this way, but it won't survive. You get a cold winter up this way, and it's going to kill it. So it just can't survive. Bermuda grass is a warm season grass, but it does go dormant in cold weather. So again, using perennial rye to help with the color and the stand is a great value for perennial ryegrass down in the South. And then there's products that they can actually use and come in on that Bermuda while it's dormant and kill off the perennial rye so that the Bermuda comes back in, and that perennial rye isn't really going to survive in the South anyways. It's just too hot. Again, perennial rye is a cool season, Bermuda is a warm season, but it can help for winter overseeding, for quality of and the aesthetics of the turf grass, especially for like golf courses, athletic fields to some degree. Again, we don't care if it sticks around, so it's more cosmetic than anything. So again, landscaper's choice, right? Get in, get out, get paid. Perennial ryegrass is revered because of its quick germination and establishment. So, basically you can throw this down, and under ideal moisture and temperatures, I mean, it'll start popping in 3 to 4 days. And, within a couple of weeks, you have Instalawn. So that makes it extremely, extremely popular. Now, if you are a full service contractor, or if you're a property manager, a facility manager, something like that, that might be great to get some quick germination, but not necessarily the easiest grass to maintain down the road. It is prone to a lot of issues, which we'll get into here momentarily. But if you're just the lucky guy that gets to come in and put that new Ryan Home lawn in, great. Most homeowners don't care anyways. They never even bother to ask what you're using. And it comes in quick, it establishes quick. So, from an installation standpoint, you can't get much better. Poor heat and drought tolerance. Okay. Again, when I talked about, it's great for the initial, that initial wow factor to get that lawn in. You're going to make that customer happy because it's up and running very quick versus tall fescue or bluegrass or something else. But that's about the best it is. It is not tolerant of heat or drought. And, here's a perfect picture of what I was talking about earlier. It has a proclivity to shredding with dull mower blades. So this is it. This is what I'm talking about, where you'll get this frosty, hazy appearance on the lawn, and then it turns yellow and straw colored. And when you look at this lawn from afar, you'd think this lawn had drought stress, and that's not the case. This is the perennial rye. Basically got beat to death because, again, that real tough cell wall around those veins, you can actually make out, if you look in this picture here, you can actually see the veins themselves in those blades of grass where they're just left stringing there. This is really hard on grass, okay? This is not a good situation for grass to be shredded like this. You're gonna invite problems. Number one, you're putting a lot of stress on that grass. every blade that gets shredded like that, it's going to dehydrate. Okay, so you're going to have desiccation set in. That blade's going to die. All right. It's gonna create, you're creating wound sites. You're gonna create entry points for diseases to get into that grass. So dollar spot, red thread, things like that. You're creating an opportunity for those diseases to go to town on that grass. You're stressing that grass out. So you're going to increase your water requirements. You're going to increase your nutrient requirements even more than they already are. You're going to invite insects to come in here, and any plant that's under stress makes an easy target for most insects, and this is not going to be any different. In general, perennial rye by itself, just in general, it does have high nutrient requirements. So when you look at all of your cool season grasses, perennial ryegrass probably has the highest nutrient requirement and the highest irrigation requirement. So again, it's prone to getting many diseases like red thread and dollar spot. So I see this a lot, especially on older ryegrass lawns. The newer varieties aren't as bad, but I am seeing more and more problems with this, especially related to nutrient deficiency. And the primary nutrient deficiency that I'm seeing is phosphorus. Phosphorus is a red light, green light nutrient. If you have it there in adequate levels, grass is fine, everything's honky-dory. The minute it drops below that threshold, you got problems. And so a lot of times on one of the dead giveaways to a phosphorus deficiency is if I go out to a lawn in the middle of summer and it's just struggling and it's thin and it's not recovering and I got red thread all over the place and dollar spot all over the place, it's probably phosphorus deficient. So again, very sensitive to nutrient deficiencies, especially phosphorus. Poor performance can be an indicator of P deficiency. So just like I hit on before, one of the characteristic diagnostic features of a phosphorus deficiency is the purpling of the leaves. And you'll see this especially in the spring on all grasses. So say we have a period here, and we might have something like this come up soon, where all right. I gotta do some recording here. It won't, it's 100%. Hey, can you help Sloan? So in the springtime, when we have cold temperatures and the warm air temperatures and cool soil temperatures, you can see this purpling because the grass is trying to grow. But when you're below about 45 degrees soil temperature, 45 degrees Fahrenheit, it's very difficult for plants to pull phosphorus out of the soil. It's not very mobile at those cold temperatures. So sometimes you can actually see this purpling on any grasses in a lawn setting, because it just is having a hard time getting that. Now, in most situations, once the soil temperatures warm up a bit and the grass can start getting that phosphorus out of the soil, it'll come out of it. The purpling goes away and it'll grow perfectly fine. But if you have a phosphorus deficiency, again, red light, green light nutrient, if you don't have it there in adequate levels, the grass just is not going to grow. It's not going to recover. It's almost like, if you think about it, if you were on immunosuppressant drugs, and you got an infection, that would be very serious. You'd have to go into the ICU. You'd have to be monitored very closely. You could end up with a lot of problems because you're immunosuppressed, whether it's medication or a disease. If your immune system's suppressed, you really can't fend off anything. You can't recover. Nothing is going to work well. And that's the same for the grass. And that's kind of what phosphorus does. It basically shuts down the plant's ability to recover and grow out of these kinds of issues. So climate shift may be causing problems as well. The climate has been changing. In Northeast Ohio, over the last, I don't know how often they do it. I think maybe it's like every 20 years or something, they reevaluate the USDA hardiness zones. And we've actually moved up a half step. So we normally have been or in the past, we've been a 5B for the USDA zone hardiness, and we've now moved into a 6A. So the climate's changing. We can tell by the way the winters have been going. We have more mild winters with less snowfall. Definitely, over the last, I've been around for a while now, but I can remember as a kid getting a lot more snow than we do today. And it's been a real challenge. If any of you are in the snow removal side of things, while I'm teaching this class, I'm also dispatching a lot of bulk salt and ice melter and things like that. So I do a lot of winter business, this time of year. And, we have to make commitments on bulk salt allocations, things like that. And I can tell you just by looking at those numbers, we've had a lot of years over the last, say, 15 years where I've only gone through maybe 35 to 40% of allocation or 50% of allocation. So, it's made it really challenging on the snow removal side to plan, on how much material you're going to need. And it's very aggravating as a supplier, trying to make sense of all of it and stay on top of it. But, we are seeing climate shift. So whether it's man-made, whether it's just because we're in one of these interglacial periods, I can't answer that. But, the fact of the matter is that we have had climate shift. This is causing more problems. Perennial ryegrass is probably going to be better suited for coastal regions with more moderate summer temperatures and more adequate rainfall. We've been drying out and heating up a lot in this region, which is very unusual. Normally around the Great Lakes region, we actually typically have what I would call more of a maritime climate. The Great Lakes do significantly influence and moderate the climate. And lately, I haven't really seen that. I've seen a lot more heat, a lot more dry over the summertime. And so, perennial ryegrass, again, it's used to, the original area that it came from is Northern Europe. So, you're thinking places like France and Germany and Denmark and Sweden and Norway and Finland and the British Isles, Northern Europe, northern maritime regions, and so when you're getting these hot, dry summers that we're getting more and more of around here, perennial ryegrass is really starting to have problems. Again, we can't use it down in the south other than as a winter cover on Bermuda because it's just going to die. I mean, you don't really have to do much to kill it. It's going to die on its own because it just cannot tolerate those high temperatures and that blazing hot sun in the south. Well, I think we're starting to see more and more of that up in this area. It's inviting some other issues in. So this picture here is it just goes to show you one of the problems that I'm seeing as a result of climate shift. We never ever had to contend with a disease called gray leaf spot. Okay, this is a devastating disease on perennial rye. There's been a lot of work over the past decade or so to develop improved ryegrass varieties that are gray leaf spot resistant. That doesn't mean that they don't get it at all. It just means that they have a better chance of surviving an attack. But at the end of the day, if you have the right conditions for this disease, which is going to be high temperatures, high humidity, think about basically like if we have the remnants of a hurricane or a tropical storm come over our region, if you remember, any of those periods of time, we end up very, very humid, not necessarily a lot of rain, but extremely humid, extremely tropical feeling. This disease loves those kinds of conditions. And when you think about how extensively this grass has been used in our landscape setting, we're starting to see a lot of problems. And I do think that that's related to climate shift. Again, we used to be wetter and cooler. I'm seeing a shift more towards hotter and drier, and it's really doing a number on rye. Another weakness of perennial rye is it needs full sun. It will not live unless it has at least 6 hours of direct sunlight. So you don't never, ever plant this in the shade. It will come up, it'll look good for 2 seconds, and then it will die. Okay. The other problem with it too is that something unique. I don't know if you've ever heard of the term of allelopathy, but allelopathy is it's a trait. It's a mechanism, a survival mechanism that many plants have developed that can kill off other plants. So it's almost like the plant in essence creates some sort of an herbicidal type compound, and then it exudes that material in its decaying plant material, also through the roots, through root exudate. It actually deposits this in the soil, and it prevents other plants from growing there. A classic example of that is the black walnut tree. It produces a compound called jugon, which is in the nuts. It's a really nasty, black, kind of pungent compound. It's in very, very high quantities in the nuts of a black walnut. So if you've ever seen them rotting, they have this black, almost like tar or oily type substance or character to them. Well, that material actually does prevent other things from growing. And that's a mechanism that black walnuts and other plants in that family kind of share, that they produce this compound, and it prevents other understory plants, other shrubs and other, basically competition. It keeps out the competition. Well, ryegrass does this too. And that's something that's unique to ryegrass. It's also another reason that I'm not a huge fan of extensively planting perennial ryegrass anymore, because if you have a problem, if you have something like gray leaf spot come in, or if you plant this in the shade, it makes it very, very difficult to get anything else to grow there. And there's really nothing that you can do. You can get in there and try and rip it up and shred up the soil and, aerate the crap out of it, or, split seed the crap out of it. And you're just not going to make much headway, because this, these allelopathic compounds stay there in the soil, and they will break down over time, but it takes a while. So again, gray leaf spot is a huge issue. If you are going to use perennial ryegrass, I highly recommend sticking with gray leaf spot resistant varieties. Most blends will tell you that. If you don't know, ask, because you definitely want to if you're going to be using ryegrass in any situation, you definitely want to make sure that it's gray leaf spot resistant. So this is that perennial ryegrass that I referred to earlier. Barenbrug developed this. It's called RPR, which stands for Regenerating Perennial Ryegrass. So this would be Lolium perenne subspecies stoloniferum. So it's Lolium perenne stoloniferum. It produces a determinate stolon, which a determinate stolon is a stolon that will produce a daughter plant that is 100% capable of producing seed. So there are indeterminate stolons, and then there are determinate stolons. This would actually produce a determinate stolon, which is producing a clonally identical plant that is capable of reproducing. All right, so now we're going to move into probably what's considered, or has been considered over the decades, the gold standard of lawns, athletic fields. This is Kentucky bluegrass. So, I think it's been synonymous with a high quality turf, for as long as anyone can remember. At least as long as we've been growing and maintaining lawns, Kentucky bluegrass has always been kind of the gold standard. So Latin name is Poa pratensis. So again, it has a folded vernation. So when you're in a blue rye setting, it can be very difficult to distinguish these two. I would say that perennial ryegrass is not as compressed. Kentucky bluegrass, if you pull a plant apart and you look at it, the stems are very, very tightly compressed. So it's a folded vernation, very tightly folded vernation. You are not going to be able, if you try to take that stem and roll it in between your fingers, you are not going to be able to. Excuse me. That's one very good diagnostic indicator when you go out to a lawn. I always say, if you're trying to figure out what it is, if you can pull a grass plant up and roll it between your fingers, it's probably not going to be perennial rye or Kentucky blue. So, and if it's very difficult to roll it, more than likely it's Kentucky bluegrass. So it has a smooth upper leaf. So if we look at this compared to, let's see, go back here. Sorry, hopefully I'm not giving you a headache. So if we compare that to the perennial rye, you can see it's subtle. Okay, this is all very subtle. The more well trained your eyes get with this, the easier it'll be to determine. But you can see, how prominent these veins are on perennial ryegrass. So they're evenly spaced across the blade, but they're very prominent. And again, this is what contributes to the shredding in the lawn setting that we see here. Again, you can see these veins. So very, very prominent vein structure on the leaf. On Kentucky bluegrass, it's not as prominent. I need you to stay out until I'm complete. I need you to stay out. Is your iPad off? Who? Zoe, give her the iPad back, please. Where is she? Zoe! You want the small phone?
Mm-hmm.
All right. Why did she do that? All right, go on out. You gotta go out. You gotta go back out with Peyton. So there's no oracles. So this is another helpful indicator when you look at this. When you pull a plant up and you pull that blade away from the stem, and you look at that collar region, you're not going to see any oracles. You are going to have a membranous ligule. So it's not as prominent as this. It's just I put in there just to kind of help illustrate here. But you are going to have a membranous ligule, and you will not have oracles on Kentucky bluegrass. So actually, I think this is. I might have actually found one. So in the ligule, if you look at that ligule, if you remember on perennial ryegrass, it was more pointed. So it is not on Kentucky bluegrass. I did find a picture of that. So the blade is boat shaped. So similar to ryegrass, because it has that folded vernation, we're going to have that keel or hull shaped blade tip where it comes to a point. But it is more of a, I'd say like more of a bow rider versus a speedboat. When you look at ryegrass, it does come to a much sharper point than bluegrass. They are both pointed. It's just that ryegrass is going to be a lot sharper. It's not going to have that kind of rounded appearance at the blade tip. It does have a prominent mid-vein. So this is trying to illustrate that here. You can see that dark line running down the center. Sometimes grasses with folded vernation, you're going to see this more than others, but Kentucky bluegrass does have a prominent mid-vein. So this is a picture that you can see here, showing like tall fescue versus Kentucky bluegrass. Tall fescue is great to compare because it does have very prominent veins. But you can see here they're evenly spaced. Sorry, my asthma is getting the worst of me today. So the Kentucky bluegrass has, again, it does have this prominent mid-rib. Or a mid-vein that's visible. It does have veins all across the leaf, but you can see they're very, very indistinguishable. And another thing that you'll sometimes see is this lightly colored band. So you have this really dark mid-rib, and then you'll have these lightly colored, very, very subtle, but you'll see these lightly colored bands running down each side of that mid-rib or mid-vein. So the appearance is typically a blue-green color. Perennial ryegrass is going to have kind of this very dark, I call it like a hunter or forest green color. Perennial ryegrass, I will say that one of the reasons that perennial ryegrass is loved is it does have dark, dark color. Of all the lawn grasses that you could plant, perennial ryegrass is the darkest. And so when people tell you that they want that dark green lawn, they're probably talking about perennial rye. Tall fescue is going to be a little bit lighter. So if I had to say on a color scale, I would say perennial ryegrass is kind of like your hunter green or a Kelly green, very, very dark. Tall fescue is more of a forest green type color. Your bluegrasses tend to be anywhere from an emerald to a blue-green color, so they're much lighter. But some people like that. I mean, it doesn't bother me. I kind of like that blue-green color to it, similar to like a blue spruce or something else. So, keep it in mind when you're planning out your landscapes and whatnot, and, depending on the color of the house, or the building that you're putting it around, it might complement it really nicely. It has a panicle inflorescence. So perennial ryegrass, if you remember, had the spike with the alternating spikelets. This actually has a panicle. And sometimes in the springtime, in between mowings, you can actually see it trying to seed, trying to reproduce, and you'll see these inflorescences through the lawn. So it spreads primarily through rhizomes. This grass actually grows really aggressively through rhizomes. It does tiller, just like any grass. It does spread by tillering, but the main way that it spreads and fills in is through rhizomes. So this is great. Great news if you're a sports facility manager, because if that soccer field or that football field gets torn up, this is going to allow it to recover very quickly in that situation. But if you're in a landscape setting, this can really suck with mulch beds. So usually if you are finding grass growing up through your rug junipers or up through the mulch, it's probably Kentucky bluegrass. So I fight this at my house because I have a blue fescue lawn. It's actually a fescue blue lawn. I started seeding tall fescue. Once I got that established, I backseeded Kentucky bluegrass into it to even out the texture, and to increase the stand diversity. But I really, the bluegrass gives me fits. So I'm probably going to get some paver edger here at some point and go in. The next time I hard edge my beds, I'm going to go in and put that paver edging in to try and deter this from happening, because it's a pain. It has fibrous roots. Like most grasses, it's going to have a fibrous root system. It is a cool season C3 grass. So again, northern latitudes, this is going to do really well. There are some improvements in varieties. There's one in particular called HGT that's another Barenbrug variety that does really well in warmer climates. It seems to thrive. They discovered this during some summer patch trials. Kentucky bluegrass is very prone to getting summer patch, especially in warmer climates. So if you're, southern Ohio going into Kentucky, Tennessee, places like that, it can get very hard to grow and maintain Kentucky bluegrass. So if they can increase the heat and drought tolerance and summer patch resistance, that's going to be better for those regions. Well, HGT actually does extremely well. It's not the darkest bluegrass. It is a little bit lighter in color, but it is aggressive. I mean, so if you have an unmaintained setting, like say it's practice fields or unmaintained, even lawn settings, where it's not necessarily going to be irrigated and you're concerned about heat, drought tolerance, the HGT bluegrass does extremely well. The other cool thing about it is it's a quick green up. I don't know if I talked about this anywhere in the slides, but there's different types of bluegrass. One of the real common varieties is a variety called Midnight. And as the name suggests, it's one of the darkest Kentucky bluegrasses that we have available. The downside of it is the texture on it sucks. It's very wide bladed and it's very loose. When you look at the canopy, it's got a very loose and open canopy. and it's very slow to establish. So it also is very slow to green up in the spring. It's one of the last to green up in the spring. And the reason I bring that up is because Midnight Kentucky Blue is really commonly used in sod. So a lot of your sod growers are using Midnight in these blends. And I've just seen a lot of situations. Actually, I can think of one specifically where I have a ball diamond that they sodded, and it was Midnight Kentucky Bluegrass sod. It was a grassed infield on this ball. Actually, the baselines and the infield are all grass. They redid this and they sodded the entire infield out to the skin, and all the baselines and everything. So the only dirt you had basically was at each mound, the home plate, pitcher's mound, and then your skin. And then you go into the outfield. Well, it's funny because in the springtime, the outfield is green and the infield on this thing looks like crap. I mean, it's again because it was Midnight Bluegrass sod. So the field manager there called me. He's like, look, we got to do something about this. So we started putting some of this RPR, regenerating perennial ryegrass, in there. And we also started using a couple of different bluegrass varieties, one of which was the HGT. And that really, really helped, with that spring green up, making it, a lot better in the spring. Because, when they start getting out there on those fields in March and April, it's not really great when you've got grass that's still dormant. So it's native to most of Europe and Northern Asia and parts of North Africa. So Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia. It was brought over to the U.S. sometime in the 1600s. So very, very early on. Again, this grass has been part of the American landscape for a long time. It's been part of the European landscape for even longer. So this is one of those varieties that when we go back to the historical section in Module 2, this was probably one of the first grasses to actually be cultivated and used in a landscape setting. And it obviously was one of the earliest grasses that was imported to the United States in the 1600s, to the colonies at that time. So the first notable variety was a variety called Marion. So this was the first actual named variety. It was discovered by a superintendent by the name of Joe Valentine at Marion Golf Club in Pennsylvania. I believe this golf club's kind of in the Philadelphia area. It's what they were referred to as the first improved variety. It was released by the USGA in 1947 in partnership with the USDA. So back in those days, most of your research, most of your variety selection, breeding, hybridization was done by universities, by your ag schools, your land grant schools like Ohio State, Penn State. So a lot of our land grant universities, because they were agricultural schools, that's where a lot of the breeding and hybridization was done. Nowadays, it's actually done primarily by the private sector. And the only thing the universities are really doing is conducting the research trials, quality ratings. So like the NTEP performance trials are done at the university level usually. So not a whole lot of variety, or breeding and hybridization is being done, and variety development's being done by the universities anymore. But back at this time, that's where it all happened. And it was done in partnership with, entities like the USDA or the U.S. Golf Association. And so this was one of the first named varieties to come out. Up to that point, bluegrass, it's pretty much just bluegrass. He found this growing, I'm not sure where it was on the golf course, but he actually found this grass growing and noted that it was unique. It just looked a little different than any of the other grasses out there. And so that's kind of how that journey started. Significant breeding was done through the 60s and 70s. So all of our grasses, all of our turf grasses that we use heavily today, a lot of those breeding efforts really didn't start until the 60s and 70s. And one of the gentlemen that was responsible for this was a gentleman by the name of Dr. Reed Funk at Rutgers University. Rutgers is over in New Jersey. So if you think about that Marion variety being in that Philly area, not too far from where Rutgers is, and Rutgers is where a lot of the initial breeding efforts. This was a school that really, out of all the universities, Rutgers was really the one that kind of put turfgrass on the map. They really pioneered a lot of the breeding and hybridization efforts. And so the turf industry as we know it today owes a lot to Dr. Funk and the work that was done there at Rutgers University. So bluegrass can be mowed at pretty low heights. If you look here, this is a bentgrass putting green, and adjacent to it is a Kentucky bluegrass collar. So, this collar region typically mowed at less than 1.5 inches or at least 1.5 inches. So, this grass is very, very good for those types of settings because it can tolerate a relatively low height of cut. It's excellent for use in athletic fields, high traffic areas. It quickly repairs and fills in due to rhizome growth. So again, excellent grass for use on athletic fields. It does have higher irrigation and fertilization requirements, but not as high as perennial ryegrass. And it's often used in combination with perennial ryegrass in cool season blends. So if you have a cool season blend that uses blue and rye, you do not want to have any more than 20 to 30% by weight perennial ryegrass. The reason is that the perennial ryegrass will outcompete at establishment. So remember what I was talking about how perennial ryegrass is kind of like the landscaper's choice because it's get in, get out, get paid. So you can go from nothing to lawn in 2 weeks. But it is prone to a lot of problems. It can be very temperamental, especially with the changing climate that we have going on in Northeast Ohio, and the poor soils that we have up here can be very challenging to grow and maintain perennial ryegrass in the long run. So if you put down a blend, say a 50-50, okay, and I love 50-50. It's beautiful, it makes a beautiful lawn. If you put down a 50% bluegrass by weight, there's more bluegrass seed in that 50-50 blend than perennial ryegrass because the two seeds are different sizes, and we'll get into this a little bit further on, but I'll hit on it here for a minute. When we say 50-50, it's by weight, but seed has different seed counts per pound. Okay, so a pound of perennial rye and a pound of Kentucky blue is not the same. There is significantly more Kentucky blue than perennial rye in a 50-50 blend. So, some people will say to me, well, Sam, why do you recommend a 50-50 blue rye blend? Well, because what we're looking at is the seed count by weight. So we don't want more than 20 to 30% ryegrass in a mix because it will outcompete an establishment, take over. You won't end up with any bluegrass in that lawn. Well, what happens if an insect issue comes along, or we have a really bad drought year, or we have a great leaf spot or something come in and take out that rye? You're not going to have the bluegrass there in any kind of number to help that recover, and you're going to end up having to renovate the lawn. So you want to make sure that you don't have more than that. And also remember the allelopathic property of perennial ryegrass. That allelopathy is going to kill off anything else. So once that perennial ryegrass gets up and gets going, if you do have any bluegrass that somehow germinates and establishes, it's just going to get killed off by the perennial rye anyway. So after about 4 to 5 years, you're not going to see anything in a lot of these blended lawns other than perennial rye, especially if it's in full sun. So you want to keep that, if you want to keep that ryegrass count down. We do have things like either 70-30s and 80-20s where we really do cut back on the amount of rye, but a 50-50 is acceptable because again, when you look at the seed count by weight, there's going to be significantly more bluegrass in that than perennial rye. And that's really what we're watching for. So most sod up here is Kentucky bluegrass because of the rhizomes holding it together. You cannot grow ryegrass sod. If you came in with a sod cutter and started cutting that off, it's literally going to disintegrate because it's just tillers. Okay, so there's nothing there to stitch it or bind it together. The rhizomes in Kentucky bluegrass, because it grows rhizomes so prolifically, those rhizomes are just growing out all through that thatch layer and through that soil interface. So those rhizomes are really helping to stitch that grass together and hold it together. Part of what makes it so great for athletic fields, it also is what allows us to grow bluegrass as sod and harvest it as sod and sell it as sod. So it tolerates a moderate amount of shade. So it'll tolerate about 4 to 6 hours of sun, as long as it's getting at least that amount, it will do fine. There are some newer varieties coming to market like Full Moon that do have improved shade tolerance. They are growing them in shade settings. So this is an area that the turfgrass breeders, people like Barenbrug and Mountain View and Pure Seed and Jacqueline's part of Barenbrug now, but that's something that these breeders have recognized that they need to start looking at is how do we grow grass and shade. So we are seeing improvements in shade tolerance with Kentucky bluegrass. Its Achilles heel is insects. So there's a number of insects that can be an issue on Kentucky bluegrass. Grubs obviously are an issue. They're an issue on any lawn, but they can be particularly devastating on Kentucky bluegrass. Billbug is another one. Billbugs will seek out and destroy Kentucky bluegrass. So I've seen a lot of extensive damage over the years with billbug. Usually we see a June, July time frame. They get going early in the spring. So the overwintering adults basically start waking up when everything else does. So when all your plants are starting to wake up, when the weeds in the lawn are starting to wake up, so are a lot of your insect pests. So your overwintering adults, those are the ones that lay the egg that cause the damage later on in the summer. And billbug is one of those. It gets going early in the spring. Chinch bug adults get going early in the spring. You won't see the problems until later on, but they get going in the spring. Another problem that I think that we're going to be increasingly facing is annual bluegrass weevil. So it's another weevil like a billbug. Looks a little bit different, but that one is becoming a bigger issue. So it's something that we're going to have to keep an eye on to see if it really starts moving into the Kentucky bluegrass lawns in a big way. So on the disease front, it's prone to getting summer patch, dollar spot, rust, and leaf spot. Now, there are a lot of improvements with summer patch. We also don't usually get summer patch up here in Northeast Ohio, but I have been seeing more and more of it, again, because of climate shift. And depending on what kind of weather we're getting over the summer, you are going to start seeing probably more and more summer patch, especially if you have a bluegrass sodded lawn or a bluegrass seeded lawn where it's extensively bluegrass. So, it's something that I keep an eye out on, some of the higher end lawns and also on my athletic fields, which are usually predominantly Kentucky bluegrass. So rust is another big issue. It usually doesn't kill the grass, but it's usually more of a cosmetic thing, especially in that August, September time frame. But it can be a real nuisance. It does also affect perennial rye. So I would point that out. It also another devastating disease on Kentucky bluegrass is leaf spot. So we can get leaf spot melting out. Usually I see that around here mid to late May. But this can also be a real problem for Kentucky blue and, of course, dollar spots. So if you have a blue rye lawn and the ryegrass starts getting hammered, it can very easily start spreading into the bluegrass. So, so now we're going to get into, I don't know why that slide formatted that way. So annual bluegrass. So you can't see it. It got cut off here. The Latin name on that is Poa annua. Annual bluegrass, as it suggests, is it's an annual grass. We're not really sure if it's. We're not really sure where or how it got started. We think that it's possibly a hybrid of Poa supina and Poa infirma, which are two other, kind of very similar grasses. They're bluegrasses, they're Poas. And we think that Poa annua might be some kind of hybrid between the two of those. It has a very, very tightly folded vernation. It has a very long blade sheath compared to Kentucky bluegrass. And it has no auricles. The ligule is pointed and silvery, and again, kind of like perennial rye, but again, remember it has no auricles at all, and it has that long blade sheath. It has a boat-shaped typo there. I'm doing horrible. Boat-shaped blade tip with prominent keel shape. So kind of like Kentucky bluegrass, it is going to have that boat-shaped blade tip with the prominent keel. It also has, again, that prominent mid-vein, very similar to Kentucky bluegrass. This is another good picture. Maybe I've got that. Yeah. So look at this one and look at this one, and what do you see? So the blade surface on Poa annua, this can be a good indicator of whether or not it's Poa annua versus Poa supina or Poa infirma. The blade margin is serrated on it, but the blade is often wrinkled. So you can feel the blade, you can feel if it's serrated versus smooth, but look for this dimpling. If you see this dimpling on the leaf blade, it's Poa annua. It has a noticeably lighter color. So when you see this, when you see Poa annua contamination, for example, on a putting green or in a lawn setting, it has a noticeably lighter color than the other grass. And it gets this kind of clumpy appearance with this light green color. It really stands out, sticks out like a sore thumb. Some people that are kind of, A-types, I guess, are going to be very annoyed seeing something like this in their lawn. And, you might be one of those people. I am. So if you're that type of person, this is going to be very annoying. And if you're a customer, you're probably going to be calling, wanting to know how to get rid of it. It has small, delicate panicles that are often present year-round. So this thing is it's a very prolific reproducer. So in the grass world, this would be your bunny rabbit. Okay, it does a really good job of reproducing. I often will see this thing. Most years, our climate is mild enough through the summer that this thing can kind of carry on through the entire summer, especially if it's in an irrigated situation. And so it's not uncommon to see this, seeding all through the summer. You're going to have to wait a minute. Go ask Zoe to get you something to eat. I'll be out in a minute, and I'm going to make you waffles. Okay? Okay. Close the door, please. I'll be out in a minute. Daddy's working. Go on. Thank you. So this, like I said, this often will continue to seed all through the through the through the summer months. If we have a cooler, wetter summer and also in an irrigated setting, you're going to see this thing. It's called Poa annua or annual bluegrass for a reason. It typically doesn't survive through the summer. Usually what happens is in the spring, you'll see it coming in. It has this really bright, kind of light limey green color in the lawn. And then, around that April, May, time frame, it starts like sending up inflorescence and, just flowering prolifically, which is really annoying for a lot of people. You'll see it all throughout the lawn, especially because it's lower growing than the rest of the grass. And, when your grass is growing really aggressively in your May time frame, and you're not getting out there you're only mowing it once a week. So you're getting a lot of head growth on that grass. You're going to see this Poa annua all over in there going like crazy a lot of times. And then towards the end of May going into June, if we're going to have a drier summer, hotter summer, it tends to yellow out. But again, anymore, I don't really see it dying out over the summer. So, it seems to be sticking around. If it does die out, don't worry, because come September, all of the seed that this thing produced, is going to be everywhere. So if we have contamination on an athletic field, if we have contamination on a golf course, a lot of effort is put into trying to maintain this and suppress the seed, because we don't want this taking over, especially on like a football field. What ends up happening is during play, as the bluegrass or the other grass on that field is getting damaged and dying off, this thing starts germinating, and it can very quickly and easily fill in and take over those areas. And once it does, your other grasses don't have a chance to really get in there, because like bluegrass, it does, it is very prolific and it is very good at establishing itself in these kinds of situations. And so, especially in compacted soils like you're going to have after football season. So it gets going and it's very difficult to get rid of. So one of the tricks that we often use is to use growth regulators to suppress the growth and suppress the seed head on it. So it has a fibrous root system, but it is very shallow rooted. So this is another issue with it, again, why it's not really an ideal grass, because if you get any kind of heat, any kind of dry conditions, poor soils, it's just not going to hold up well in those kinds of situations, which is why you're not going to want to use it or not going to want to have it in an athletic field situation. It is a cool season grass. So in fact, the further north you go, if we cross over Lake Erie into Canada, they don't mind this grass at all, because it actually does quite well up there. It can tolerate the cold. It's a winter annual grass. It's a cool season, but even beyond that, it's a winter annual. So this thing germinates in the fall, in your September time frame, and then it just hunkers down and sits there all winter. So It can survive some pretty cold conditions. So, like I said, up in Canada, this might be a good fit for you. But, around these parts in Ohio, especially around Cleveland and getting into central Ohio, we're not a big fan. It spreads primarily through tillering and prolific seeding. So it doesn't grow rhizomes the way that that Kentucky bluegrass does. But again, if we go back a couple here, I mean, you can see how tight the tillering is on that. So it's a bunch grass. And so because it forms that very thick colony of grass, that's what I mean. Once it gets going through that prolific seeding and it germinates, it goes to town. It starts growing aggressively, filling in, tillering like crazy. And by that mechanism, it crowds out any of your other desirable grasses from getting in there. So again, it can make it a nuisance. Again, it's a winter annual. It germinates in the fall. It flowers in the spring. It tends to yellow out in warmer summer months, but I have not really seen it completely dying. It just kind of looks very sick through most of the summer. In Northeast Ohio, particularly, depending on which kind of climate pattern we're in, depending on the year, if it's a cooler, wetter summer, it does help this to linger on year round. So the whole summer, it's just sitting there, happy as a lark, throwing up more seed heads, producing more seed. Irrigation and cooler weather help keep it alive. It grows more prostratically. So prostrate means it grows, lays out across the soil surface. So because it does that, because those stems tend to lay out over the surface of the soil, it will tolerate very, very low mowing conditions, so less than a quarter inch. A lot of golf courses use this, have to manage this on the putting green situation. Again, you can see this would be what you would probably call a 50-50 POA bent green. This is quite common in a golf situation, to see this, because again, that Poa annua is gonna do just fine at those low heights of cut because of that prostratic growth. So it's just gonna do fine in that situation. So again, don't really want it on athletic fields, ball diamonds, soccer fields, football fields, polo fields. Name your field. We don't really want it out there. It has poor wear tolerance, but it quickly takes over in heavily worn areas like athletic fields. So it can be a real nuisance if we don't stay on top of it. So lowering your mowing height actually promotes growth. So if you have clients, or if you yourself tend to mow at a lower height of cut, let's say you're at 2 inches, 2.5 inches versus 3 to 4 inches, you're actually going to make conditions more favorable for Poa annua to come in. So even in an established lawn setting, an established healthy lawn, we can end up inviting this bad house guest in to the lawn just with our mowing height. So this can be a very good management tip, and I've recommended this to some of my athletic field managers, that we actually raise the height of cut off season. So when we're trying to we can always raise and lower the height of cut. Okay, we have to do it incrementally, but we can drop that height of cut as we approach the season of play. So just keep that in mind as a management tool, that if you're rotating fields, if you're out of play, if you're out of season, why not raise the height of cut? That's really gonna, I think, help you to manage Poa annua on these fields and in a lawn setting. So it's commonly seen in poor compacted soil. It's an indicator of problems. So if we see an area where it's just inundated with Poa annua, that's usually a pretty good indicator that we've got some structural soil issues, or maybe there's poor fertility. Maybe this is an area that gets damaged pretty heavily by salt, de-icing salts and things like that. This is a skin, so this would be on a ball diamond. Here's your grass infield, here's your outfield. So, perfect example. I mean, if any of you have played baseball, softball, you're probably familiar with this, especially on a lot of your municipal, lower budget fields where they're not maintaining these skins. Frequently, you'll see Poa annua coming in all over on this. So it's a real common unwanted house guest in these kinds of situations. It's prone to getting diseases. So one of the bad ones that it can get is anthracnose. So this can be particularly devastating on, a couple different grasses, but Poa annua especially, it'll get in there and it takes it out. You'll get this anthracnose basal rot where it basically kills it out. So now we're going to move into another one. This is a cool season grass. Sometimes it's used. Any of these grasses that I'm talking about, these aren't necessarily desirable. Okay, sometimes they are. Sometimes you'll see them in bid specs. Sometimes it may make sense to try to manage or maintain them, depending on your situation. So these kind of fall into they may be friend, they may be foe. So Poa annua obviously could be a friend, could be a foe. It just depends on your vantage point and what you're trying to accomplish. In a golf course setting, if it's a 50-50 push-up green, you're probably just going to live with it, right? Your goal in that situation is to maintain it. You're not going to eradicate it. You're just going to live with it, and you're going to maintain it, and you're going to try and keep it as healthy as possible so your greens don't check out. Poa supina or supine bluegrass is another one of these where it is used. It is used more and more frequently in a landscape setting. It does have some attributes that might make it favorable. There's only one named variety that I can think of. I want to say it's called Supernova. I could be wrong, but there's only one named variety of the supine bluegrass that I'm aware of. It's used more extensively over in Europe, especially Northern Europe, than it is in North America. But there is increased awareness and increased use of it. So again, it's very similar to Poa annua. It's thought to be one of the parents. So if you remember in an earlier slide, we talked about Poa infirma and Poa supina. So, we think that Poa annua is actually a hybrid between those two. I think, if you think when we got back to the turfgrass morphology and biology, and we were talking about genetics and how we're doing a lot more genetic assaying of plant species. And so when you run the genetic assays on all three of those, there are a lot of genetic similarities. Genomic similarities between these grasses, and that's what's kind of leading them to believe that they are that Poa annua could actually be a hybrid. The blade ligule and auricle are all similar. The ligule is slightly shorter than Kentucky bluegrass or Poa annua, so that's something to look for. It does have a lighter green color, so kind of similar to Poa annua. It is not a very dark grass. The seed head is one indicator. So I wouldn't say that it's a prolific seeder. If you see a lot of prolific seeding going on out in, say, a football field or something, more than likely it's Poa annua. The other interesting thing about it is if you do have this and you catch it when it's seeding, again, it's not really a prolific seeder the way Poa annua is, but it will send some up. They actually have a purple color. Poa annua is white. So this can be really helpful, especially on athletic fields in trying to identify whether this is Poa supina or Poa annua. Um, I have an athletic field up in the area, and I've actually been finding this Poa supina more and more even in lawn settings. But I have an athletic field up here in Northeast Ohio that the football field is covered with this. And originally, because I wasn't familiar or expecting to see this up this way. I hadn't really run across it before in the past. I actually deferred to Pam Sherritt and Dr. Gardner, Dave Gardner, down at Ohio State University, because I was just stumped. I'm like, this looks like Poa annua, but it's not like any Poa annua that I've ever seen. It's much different, and we'll see here in a second. So once established, after a few seasons, it seldom flowers. So if you go out on a field and you have this grass, it's taking over it, or a lawn, and you see this light colored grass, it's kind of taking over, but you can tell it's been there for a while. It's pretty well established, but it doesn't really seem to be flowering at all. It's probably Poa supina, or it could be. I would definitely consider Poa supina being the causal agent. It spreads primarily by stolons. The stolons are short. They have an internodal length of anywhere from a half an inch to 2 inches, but it grows very, very short. Stolons, again, tends to be more prostratic in its growth. It spreads by stolons, and that's what threw me off on this one particular field where I deferred. I said, this looks like Poa annua, but it's actually growing stolons. And I've never really seen that before. It's not dramatic. It's not like a Kentucky bluegrass or a Bermuda grass stolon, but it definitely, you can see these stolons coming off, and you can see, every half inch or so, you can see these daughter plants basically forming along that stolon. It's native to Alpine Europe, so it was relatively recently discovered growing there in the 1930s. So again, this is a relatively newly known to us grass. We look here, these are the Alps. So here's France, so French Alps, Swiss Alps, Italian Alps, Austrian Alps. So this region here bordering basically Austria, Switzerland, France, and northern Italy, this is where we have found, and these markers actually indicate where we found this grass growing natively. Relatively recently discovered, and as you would imagine, there were some things that people liked about it, so there have been efforts to breed it for use in athletic fields and golf courses. The recommended mowing height is 1¼ inches, 1 to 1¼ inches in the sun and 2 inches in the shade. It will tolerate being mowed down a half an inch. So, when I have had this growing in higher cut athletic fields, one of the ways that we've been able to manage this is by dropping that height of cut. If we get it down into, say, that inch and a half range, the Poa supina contamination that's in there seems to do really well. Okay, it's not a sturdy grass. It's not going to hold up through play, but it does really quickly regenerate and fill in. Unfortunately, one of the things that ends up happening is as you're cleaning this stuff up, I mean, you'll go out on a field that has this in it after play, and you literally see these stolons, and chunks of it laying all over. Well, guess what? It grows from that just fine. So as soon as those can re-root into the soil, you've just spread that stuff all over. So again, it can be a real nuisance if you're trying to manage it on like a football field between the hash marks. It can be a real challenge because of that. But one of the tricks that we do use to try and help at least keep it and maintain it is to drop that height of cut. It doesn't do well in higher cut turf. But again, in an athletic field situation, if you're trying to maintain it, you might be stuck with it, and you don't have the money to basically resod the field or renovate it. You might be stuck with just trying to live with it. So again, dropping that height of cut can be one of the ways that we can use it. It does, like I said, it does have a relatively high wear tolerance. So if you're maintaining it properly and you can keep it tight to the soil, it will tolerate a fair amount of wear. It does tend to chunk out and break out in heavy play, but it recovers very, very quickly. It does very well in shade. So if you have crappy, especially a lot of areas up Avon Lake, North Ridgeville, Lorain, Elyria, up along the lake region where we tend to be a little bit swampier. It does really well in our shaded, wet, and compacted soil. So, I don't know. It's not an easy one to find. I know we don't sell it. I don't really sell it. But it is something to take note of. And, maybe if you have a guinea pig yard or something, a guinea pig area somewhere, it might be worth maybe trying to get a hold of some of this and playing around with it and seeing how it does. It's not tolerant of heat and drought stress. So again, this is a real problem on an athletic field situation, but it's also a strategy, a technique that I've tried to employ to get rid of it. Okay. This stuff is not tolerant of drought at all. I mean, if you go in and please go away. I will be out in a minute. I'm almost done. I will get you food, but you need to be a good listener. Go sit with Peyton, please. Please go to Zoe. Do you want food? Is that what you want? All right. Here, have a suck. Almost. So this is one of the strategies that I try to employ with managing this or eradicating it. It's something that we're playing around with because, again, this is a relatively new issue that I've run into. So fortunately, I have some patient, field people that I'm working with, and we're all kind of trying to learn and play with this together. So it's not a it's not tolerant of heat and drought stress the way that, Kentucky bluegrass is. And that can help us because if we have an athletic field and say I go in there and I seed it with a Tuaca certified bluegrass, something like the HGT or the 365 SS would be another good option. Those will tolerate a fair amount of heat drought. And so what I can do over the summertime is basically allow that field to bake. We'll give it the bare minimum amount of water that we need to. We'll let it grow out taller, a little taller. So it gives it a little bit of added heat and drought tolerance with the higher height of cut, and then we just let it dry. The idea here is that if we don't irrigate that field and we let the drought set in, that things like Poa annua and Poa supina just aren't going to be able to survive those kinds of situations. Unfortunately, I haven't had, it's a great theory, but the weather just has not cooperated the last couple of years to see if this holds any weight. But it is an idea that I have for managing this grass. It could be snow mold and dollar spot resistant. So Good, bad, and ugly, right? I mean, it just depends on your vantage point, how and where you're trying to use this. So, um, maybe a more shaded fairway type situation on a golf course, this might have a better fit because it's not going to have snow mold or dollar spot issues. So it's too soon to say, but there is some initial study work that suggests that this is snow mold and dollar spot resistant. And I guess that would make sense, from the snow mold standpoint, if this is growing or it's more of an alpine grass. It would make sense that it would have some snow mold resistance. So the next one we're going to hit here, also another POA species. This is called rough-stocked bluegrass. The Latin name is Poa trivialis. You may have heard of this. Again, folded vernation. Again, it has the boat-shaped blade tip. It does not have auricles. It does have a pointed ligule. So, could be confused. I mean, if you were just looking at this, I mean, it could be confused with perennial rye. But it's not, it doesn't have a silvery ligule like Poa annua. It's more of like a green color. So that is one indicator between it and Poa annua. So you can differentiate it from those. The blade is still keel shaped, but more pointed at the tip. So it's not as rounded. It does come to more of a point. The blade's a little bit flatter than, say, Poa annua or Poa pratensis, which is Kentucky bluegrass, or even Poa supina. So it is a little bit flatter blade when you see it growing. It does have that prominent midrib again. It has a much finer blade texture than Poa annua and Poa pratensis. So when you see it, so here's a good picture showing the two. Poa annua is going to have a much broader or wider blade than than rough-stocked bluegrass, more similar to Kentucky bluegrass. Rough bluegrass or rough-stalk bluegrass, Poa trivialis, has a much finer texture. So it's a much softer, finer texture, thinner blade, much more like a fine fescue. It's a lighter green color, similar to creeping red fescue. Again, sometimes it can be hard to distinguish this from a fine fescue. But the inflorescence is a panicle. So you will see this sometimes kind of like Poa annua. Again, not as prolific, but it does sometimes, when it's left unmowed, grow out that inflorescence. It has a fibrous root system, but the root system is very, very fine, even finer than annual bluegrass. Very, very fine. The grass is fine. The stemming on it is very fine. The leaves are fine. It's very, very superficially rooted. It tends to grow as like a mat. So when you find it in a lawn, you'll see it growing over top of the other grass. It is a cool season grass. So much like everything else we're covering, this is one of the cool season grasses. Like I said a moment ago, it is mat forming. It spreads primarily by stolons on top of other grasses. And as it's laying out over top of those grasses, it ends up more or less suffocating them and choking them out. It goes dormant when temperatures reach 90 degrees, like clockwork. It starts turning a maroon color, and then it just basically turns to straw. So this is, this shows us here in a couple different pictures. So initially, you'll see it turning this color, and it's kind of funny because about the time that we see these 90-degree temperatures set in, which is usually around like late May, early June, it could happen a little bit later depending on the spring, but whenever we see that, I always start getting several phone calls every year from clients of mine saying, can you come out and look at this lawn? I got this weird disease. Or they'll send me pictures of this disease, and I'll go look at it. And I'm like, oh, that's that's, they're like, what is that? I say, that's the Poitras checking out disease. And they're like, what's that? And I said, well, it's Poitras and it's checking out. So I always joke with them that it's the Poitras checking out disease, but they're frightened because they go out and they see these huge areas. Imagine you see a lawn and you see these huge areas turning this kind of like purpley maroon brown color, and then as soon as that happens, no sooner than that happens, it just basically turns brown, like this brown or, straw color. And they're like, man, what happened? This isn't like Pythium or something else. It's like, no, it's Poa trivialis. It does prefer poor soils. So it, again, like Poa annua, it can be an indicator of poor soils. The lower mowing height can be pretty common in areas where you have a lower mowing height, so it doesn't really like growing in higher cut turf, and it can also be a sign of poor drainage. So anywhere where you're prone to having wet soils, waterlogged soils, standing water, I mean, it's not uncommon to see this. It does tolerate and is often found growing in shade. So I don't usually see it growing in the full sun. It can sometimes, if the conditions are right. You can sometimes find this growing in the full sun. Usually it is growing somewhere though where it is at least getting shade for some portion of the day. And a lot of times I'll see it in a turf setting growing on like the margin, where you're, say you have a wood lot or a tree line. A lot of times you'll see it growing kind of on that margin between the shade and the sun, but it's usually on the shade side of that, growing in the shadier areas. It can be, again, confused with creeping bentgrass because of that stoloniferous habit. So it's one thing to look for. Are we dealing with bentgrass or are we dealing with Poa trivialis? In most situations, it is considered undesirable for the reason that it basically checks out, goes dormant. It does have a different texture, a different color, so it can appear as like patches or mats of contamination growing in a lawn. So it can be a bit of an eyesore, both from how it grows, what it looks like in the lawn setting, but also because, again, once summertime hits, it basically just checks out. It says see you in September. So now we're going to move into fine fescue. So this is a whole different genus. So we started with Lolium, with the rye, perennial rye. Then we moved into our Poas, the Poa species. Now we're going to move into the fescue. So fine fescue, there's multiple species. We just kind of lump them all together. So the Latin names, the more common ones would be Festuca rubra and Festuca ovina. Chewings, hard, sheep, and creeping red are all the main types that you're going to come across. So again, they're all very, very similar. It can be somewhat difficult unless you're very well trained to determine the difference between them. That's why they all pretty much share the same characteristics, so we all keep them kind of together. So they also have a folded vernation, but the leaves tend to be very thick and curled, almost like a pine needle, so it's very hard to tell. And if you look here, you can see that stem. I mean, very, very fine, hence the name fine fescue. So very, very fine bladed, very, very fine and delicate stems. There are no auricles. They do have a membranous ligule, but again, because that blade tends to fold over and curl up on itself, good luck seeing that. So the chewings and hard fescues have wire-like blades. The creeping red tends to open up more and look more like a very fine perennial rye. So that can be one thing to help you. If you see like very, very fine, almost wire-like blades, you're probably dealing with a chewings or a hard fescue. If the blade is a little more open, like a perennial rye, like a very fine bladed perennial rye, or even like a Poa trivialis or something like that, then more than likely it is that creeping red fescue. The blade tip is pointed. It's almost needle-like. Again, think of a pine needle. Almost like, say, more like a 2 or 3 needled pine, like an Austrian pine. So they're very needle-like. And the creeping red tends to have a much lighter green color than the chewings or hard fescue. The patches of it can tend to stand out in a lawn, sort of like Poa trivialis, and that's why I said you could almost confuse it with Poa trivialis. The way that you're going to know the difference is that Poa trivialis is, it's got those stolons, right? It grows that bat and it lays out over the grass. These don't do that. So it grows in clumps or bunches. Both hard and red fescues tiller and form dense patches, but creeping red will grow rhizomes. So you will get a little bit of spreading out of that creeping red. That's why it's called creeping. It is going to be a little bit more aggressive, not significantly more aggressive, but a little more aggressive than a hard or fine fescue, or I'm sorry, chewings or a hard fescue. It's going to be a little bit more aggressive than that, but that's not saying much. They have fibrous roots. So, again, like many of the other grasses, we're not dealing with any kind of real thick, meaty root system. They are a cool season grass. They are native to the cool temperate parts of region of the European continent. So they're commonly found in these coastal areas. So, Denmark, Netherlands, northern France, Portugal, Spain, Ireland, England. That's typically where we're seeing it growing. What, honey? I'll be out in a sec, okay? So that's typically where we're going to see them growing. They are shade tolerant, so they only need about 3 to 4 hours of direct sun. They're often the main component of shade seed blends because of that shade tolerance. Again, they will not grow in total shade. That's a common misnomer with these shade blends is, oh, I got all these trees, I can just put this in here and grow fine. No, they won't. They still need at least, dappled sunlight throughout the day or 3 to 4 hours of direct sunlight at some point in the day. But when it comes to shade tolerance, this is about as tolerant as you're going to get. They do best. Please stop. Okay. Here. Go sit down at the kitchen counter. There we go. So they do best, they perform the best, like most grasses, they're going to do best in full sun, but they are not heat or drought tolerant. And this picture here shows that very well. I mean, even in an irrigated situation, they just do not do well in heat and drought. So if you see like landscaper blends, I get real leery with those because a lot of times the landscaper blends are going to have some kind of fine fescue in them. And, one of the blends I could think of, this would probably date me, but the Hubert blend is a common one, especially up in like that Avon Lake, Bay Village neck of the woods, Rocky River. There was a company up there that basically didn't do anything special, but they put a blend in a bag. It's called the Hubert's blend. It was known colloquially by a lot of the older landscape companies up in that area as the Hubert's mix or the Avon Lake seed mix. It's not, just because you give something a special name doesn't mean it's special or you should buy it, right? And this is one of those situations. I'm not a big fan of it. Everything has its purposes, and if you must, you must, but I'm not a big fan of it, again, because if you go out and you plant this grass blend that has bluegrass, ryegrass, and fine fescue in it,
what do you think is going to happen to that fine fescue in that lawn? And again, think about the fact that now you've got a 2-to-1 in that bag against the Kentucky bluegrass. So pretty much what's going to happen is you're going to end up with either ryegrass or fine fescue or both of them. You're not really going to have much bluegrass in there at all, because you got a two against one, tag team in that bluegrass in that bag. And then, the ryegrass with the allelopathy is going to duke it out with the fine fescue in there. That fine fescue is prone to checking out because of the heat and drought. Plus, it gets a myriad of other diseases, so not a fan. It does have a more moderate requirement for water, though, and a very low nitrogen requirement. So if you happen to be fortunate enough to have kind of a cooler, wetter area where you're getting more dews and fogs and things like that, like coming in off the ocean, and you're trying to manage, nitrogen and other nutrients, this one does fit the bill for that. So again, it's not necessarily a bad grass. So what we'll talk about here, it's not this here, the green grass. It is actually being grown in these roughs. So this would be like a link style golf course. And so this area here would actually be your ryegrass. It does prefer acidic soil. So again, in our areas, we tend to have a lot of alkaline soils. It really depends on where you are in Northeast Ohio. If you're further north and further west, you're going to be more alkaline. If you're further south and east, you're going to be more acidic. So this grass is going to do much better in acidic soil. It will actually tolerate pHs down to 3 or 4. I had a situation where I had a big spoil mound where they had dredged a pond on a property and they needed to grow grass on it. Apparently the property management company decided that they wanted to dispose of the soil on site versus having to haul it away somewhere to save some money. So they built this big, huge mound and their goal was to cover it with grass. Well, they couldn't get grass to grow on it. So a client of mine and I ended up going in and we did some soil testing and we found that the pH was about like 3.5. So really, really acidic stuff that came out of the bottom of that pond. And so we did two things. For one, we came in and we blew soil over the top of this thing to try and cap it. But then I recommended that basically we go in and use fine fescue, and we basically used a link style fine fescue to go in there because I said basically nothing else is really going to grow in there. It's just too acidic. And for that reason, it is relatively tolerant of poor soils. Again, low nitrogen requirement, relatively low irrigation requirement. It just doesn't do well. It's just not going to hold up to any kind of dry. It's just going to go dormant. It doesn't mean it's going to do it in. It's just going to go dormant and see you in the fall. It is very susceptible to leaf spot and brown patch. So this is one of the biggest challenges that I've seen up this way, especially due to climate change. I'm seeing a lot more of these warmer weather diseases like brown patch becoming a bigger and bigger issue in Northeast Ohio, and leaf spot also, because we tend to be much warmer and much wetter in that May-June time frame than we have been historically. Usually we tend to be cooler and drier in May, but that just hasn't been the case as of late. So I'm seeing much more leaf spot and I'm seeing much more brown patch up this way. It's often used for naturalizing in no-mow situations like golf course roughs, but it can tolerate a wide range of mowing heights down to, 1/4 of an inch. So, you could theoretically use it, in lower mowed areas like around collars and stuff on golf courses. Typically, we don't. Most cases, we use it like this, just as you're seeing it here in a links type or a naturalized type setting. So last one here, I believe this will be the last one that I'm talking about on our cool season grasses. This is one of my favorites. It's become one of my favorites over the years. This is tall fescue, and this is Festuca arundinacea. So this is really becoming a great grass up in our region. So rolled vernation. So real easy when you go out into a lawn setting to identify this. It has that rolled vernation. The auricles are short and blunt. They're not necessarily malformed the way that they are on perennial rye, but they are short and blunt. And they don't fully clasp the stem. So it's kind of open instead of coming completely around at the collar there. And at the sheath, they are a little bit more open, so they don't completely clasp. The ligule is membranous, but it's very short. You'll actually see it if you pull the blade away from the stem. You'll see this ring right around the stem region on that collar. And this is actually, that would be the ligule. So it's very short, almost absent, but when you pull it away and look directly down, you'll see it there. The collar is wide and continuous, so you'll see it's a little bit lighter color, so very light, noticeably lighter and whiter. There could be short hairs at the collar region. I don't typically see the hairs on the improved turf type varieties, but it is possible. But that collar region, again, it is continuous, it is broad, and very noticeable and distinguishable because of that light color. The leaf blade is flat, so very flat coming off that stem. And again, we saw this picture before. The veins are very prominent and they are equally spaced. Here's look at it again. So there's no mid vein there, but we do see these very prominent, very equally spaced veins on the leaf. The blade margin is very rough, like sandpaper. You can almost pick it out here in this picture a little bit. It's hard to pick out the serration on that blade there, but it is rough like sandpaper. It has a dark green appearance. It's not as dark. Remember, we talked about like that, what do they say, Kelly green, or like a forest or a hunter green, I'm sorry. It is a darker green color, but more like maybe a forest green. It's not as dark as perennial rye. Noticeably darker than Kentucky bluegrass, but just a different green. I think it's a pretty green. Again, depending on the aesthetics of your environment, what you're trying to pair it up with, maybe, the house colors or whatever, the tall fescue might be a better fit with the house. And man, my mouse is touchy today. The one thing that makes this grass so cool is it does have a fibrous root system. But look at this root system. I mean, these roots go down to China. Literally. I mean, they can be sometimes 2 to 3 feet in the ground. They're gonna, in a lawn setting, you're gonna see these roots go down at least 10, 12 inches. But my guess is if you kept digging, you're gonna see them going even deeper than that. I mean, this is one of the best things about this grass, is just how deeply rooted this grass is. It is a bunch grass. It spreads primarily by tillering, but it can produce rhizomes under intensely maintained circumstances. What's an intensely maintained circumstance? A lawn, okay? Especially if you're keeping that height of cut lower, you can promote rhizome growth out of this. It's nothing to write home about. It's nothing compared to like Kentucky bluegrass. It's not going to take over your mulch beds the way Kentucky bluegrass can, where you'll see these bluegrass plants coming up like a foot away from the lawn in the mulch bed. So it's nothing like that, but it does produce rhizomes that can grow out. The flower, again, is a spike, so similar to your fescues, your fine fescues, and your perennial ryes. It does have a spike flower. It is a cool season grass. it has very low fertility requirement. It only requires 2 to 3 pounds of nitrogen per year. It does have higher water consumption than your other cool season grasses. In fact, if I ranked them, I would say tall fescue actually uses the most water. Then I would say perennial rye. Then I would say Kentucky bluegrass, and then your fine fescues would be at the low end. But the neat thing, that the adaptation that it has is, again, this deeply rooted fibrous root system that goes down feet into the ground. So the benefit to that is that in a drought type situation, that tall fescue can hold on just fine, because imagine that root that you just saw in that column going down through that soil. So, where a lot of these grasses max out at maybe about 8, 10, 12 inches in the soil, this thing keeps on going. It can tap into water reserves deeper down in the soil profile. So it has very good heat and drought tolerance because of its ability to deeply root. So it's very tolerant of a wide range of soil quality, pH, climate conditions, which has really led to its quick rise in economic value. It's a relative newcomer on the landscape scene in the scheme of things, but it's very versatile grass, which has allowed it to be very extensively used. So this would be one example. It's very commonly used in this kind of a setting, on your roadsides and medians on highways, because of its ability to weather salt, poor soil. You're getting baked here if you imagine the heat and glare that's going to come off of this pavement. So it can tolerate that. It's a very tough grass and very versatile. It was brought to the U.S. in the late 1800s, so later than probably bluegrass and perennial rye, but it probably started being used more extensively than perennial rye. It didn't catch on, though, until the 1940s. Prior to that, it was used primarily as a forage grass. K31 was one of the first varieties that was commercially produced and brought to market. The ecotype was actually noticed on a steep hillside in Kentucky because it remained green all winter. Tall fescue otherwise goes dormant, so that's one of the interesting things about it. It is an alpine grass. We'll talk about this here in a second. It is an alpine grass, but its survival mechanism that it's developed is it tends to go dormant. And this K31 was noticed again because down in Kentucky, where they found it growing, it remained green all winter long on this hillside. K31 was and is used primarily for forage. It began being marketed back, I'd say really heavily back in the 70s and 80s for lawns by Pennington. It first kind of showed up in the 1950s. There's finer bladed turf type tall fescues that began coming out in the 1980s, early 90s. They have better tillering and better density and texture. And then you have what are called the dwarf types or compact blends. Those started showing up in the 90s. So this would be your first kind of generation or first iteration of what you would call turf type tall fescue. That would be your K31. And then next to it, you can actually see what these improved varieties. So when I say I really like tall fescue, I'm not really thinking about K31. I'm really thinking about these improved turf type varieties, the dwarf types, and the the more what we call turf type varieties. They have finer blade texture, lower growth height overall. They're still going to grow taller than Kentucky bluegrass or perennial rye, but they're not as bad as like a K31. Better tillering, so you can see the density. You see this openness in the K31 versus how tight the stem density and leaf density is in the improved varieties. So again, most of that came about in the 80s and the 90s and continues on today. So they're native primarily to the Pyrenees Mountains of France and Spain. So very, very isolated. They, kind of like that Poa supina is pretty isolated to the Alps. This species of grass is primarily confined to this region of Europe, the Pyrenees Mountains. So it is found to some degree in the Alps in northern Italy. It's found to some degree in some of the hills of Portugal, and also a little bit in some of the higher regions in northern Africa. But again, this is kind of the epicenter. This is the primary area of Europe where this grass originated from. The northern continental morphotypes. So we're going to introduce a new term here, morphotype. So there's some variation in the species of tall fescue, and they refer to these as morphotypes. So they're genetically similar, very, 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 very similar, but there's a little bit of different, phenotype expression between these different morphotypes of tall fescue. So the northern, or as they call them, continental morphotypes, are from north of the Pyrenees. They are dominant, these are the ones that go dormant in winter, and they inconsistently grow rhizomes. So if you remember, I said earlier that tall fescue tillers, it primarily tillers, but it also has the ability under certain circumstances to grow rhizomes. The continentals don't really do that. And honestly, almost all of the work that has been done in breeding and hybridization on turf type tall fescue is with continental types. So this is why I'm bringing this up, and this is why I want you to know this, that most varieties of tall fescue are continental, which means in Cleveland, in Northeast Ohio, if you're, say, up around Lake Erie, if you're, say, north of Detroit Road going towards the lake, these can really struggle to green up in the spring. A lot of times I don't see these continental varieties coming out of dormancy until early to mid-May. And if you use this grass in these kinds of situations, you may get some complaints. Also, even in other areas, like if you're going out towards Sandusky, Fremont, Norwalk, going out further west where they tend to get a bit colder. If you're going a little bit further south, like in the higher areas of, say, around Mansfield, it does tend to be a little bit colder there. You are going to see much more dormancy, although because you don't have the lake keeping things cooler along the shoreline and moderating that temperature. If you're south of Detroit Road, if you're further inland, usually you're going to get enough heating through the day to bring these things out of dormancy in April. But I just bring that up because if you're north of Detroit Road, if you're in, say within 5 miles or so of Lake Erie, you do stand a chance of these things staying dormant much later, and you might have some unhappy customers. So most of your forage and turf type tall fescues do come from this group, as I said. So there's another morphotype that is called rhizomatous tall fescue, or RTF. And this morphotype actually comes more from this region here in northern Spain and a little bit into Portugal, and on the southern side of the Pyrenees Mountains. So they develop because you have one that's on one side of the mountains and you have one that's on the other side of the mountains. They develop very distinctly different from each other. So so that's why we have these morphotypes. So the northern continental morphotypes would be more up in this region, and the southern RTF morphotypes are developed distinctly in this region of Spain and over into Portugal. So they're more cold tolerant. Interestingly, they are more cold tolerant. They actively grow in the summer and late fall versus in the spring. And they are very active in mild winters. They're not as hardy as continental types, but they do lend well to more mild climates. So if you're in USDA hardiness zones like 6A, 6B, 7, even into 8, where you have more mild winter conditions, these grasses will do very well. I personally have RTF at my house as one of the tall fescues in my lawn. I've used it very extensively up here in Northeast Ohio. It does do very well. It does. I'm not going to lie. It does very well. But again, you have to watch that cold tolerance on it. It's not going to be as cold tolerant overall as it's not going to be as cold tolerant overall as the continental types as surviving. Like if we have like a polar vortex winter, you might see some loss, some damage, especially if it's a relatively younger tall fescue lawn. But we've had a lot of mild winters here this year or in the past few years. In fact, we tend to be like a 50-50 crapshoot depending on the winter, what we're going to be, warmer, colder. But when we have these mild winters, these rhizomatous tall fescues do very well. And again, they grow actively through the summer. So if we are moving into more mild winters overall, if we are moving into hotter summers, these rhizomatous tall fescues are going to be a good way to go. There's one other type we'll talk about. This would be the Mediterranean morphotype. It's summer dormant, winter active, not very cold tolerant. It's used as a forage. It doesn't really have any commercial value. So just to keep in mind, there's 3 types. We have our continental, we have our rhizomatous, and then we have the Mediterranean. The Mediterranean, we're not going to run into ever. If we see tall fescue, it's going to be predominantly continental, and we are starting to see some development with the rhizomatous. Along those lines, Turf Saver with RTF is the first and only blend marketed with a true rhizomatous tall fescue morphotype variety, and the name of that variety is Labyrinth. Now, when you buy a bag of RTF, it's not 100% Labyrinth, okay? They do blend it with continental varieties. Why? Because number one, it's expensive. Okay. Number 2, we have limited quantities of it. And 3, because again, if you remember what we talked about, the differences in the growing conditions and climate conditions between the tall fescues, the rhizomatous, is better in certain circumstances. The continentals are better in other circumstances. Most of what we have on the market do come from continentals. Just because of the variety of weather that we have around here, it's not a bad idea to have a blend. Plus, if you had all RTF, if something came along and decided to do it in like brown patch or something, what are you left with? So, we always want to have genetic variety in a blend. But there is a decent amount of the Labyrinth tall fescue in that Turf Saver with RTF. And again, the reason I bring this up is you're going to see other varieties on the market trying to do their marketing PR spin, trying to promote it as a rhizomatous tall fescue. But the only way that it can truly be a rhizomatous tall fescue is if it is from that RTF morphotype. And to date, the only RTF morphotype that has been developed is this Labyrinth, which is in the Turf Saver with RTF. So almost all tall fescues have naturally occurring endophyte in them to deter insect feeding. But this is also a challenge because you can't use a lot of these for grazing because the the endophyte in there, the endotoxin that it produces, will make grazing animals sick. And so what is an endophyte? An endophyte is a symbiotic relationship between an internal fungus and the plant. So this fungus actually, it lives inside the plant. All right. And when the seed is produced on the grass, there's actually endophyte spores along with that seed. So it's actually present with the seed. And so when that seed germinates, that endophyte immediately inoculates and starts that symbiotic relationship. So it's kind of like a mycorrhizae in a sense, except that in this case, you have a symbiotic relationship where the fungus is being fed. So the plant is sacrificing some of its nutrients that it's producing, but in exchange, that fungus is producing endotoxins, which will help this grass survive. It'll deter animals from feeding on it. It'll also deter insects from feeding on it. The tall fescues do tend to, unfortunately, be prone to brown patch and snow mold, so that is something that you're going to want to watch out for, on with these, especially in a winter like this winter. I guarantee as the snow melts off, you're going to see a lot of snow mold. It's not going to do it in. It's just it's a cosmetic thing. Typically, it doesn't kill the tall fescue. It will come out of it in the spring. But nonetheless, they are prone to some tall fescue and brown patch. There has been a lot of work, especially with the continental types, to improve the brown patch resistance. And the Turf Saver with RTF does have some brown patch resistance in it. I will say personally, though, I don't know how much resistance the Labyrinth RTF actually has. And I think that's part of the reason that we have the continental types in there, is to give it some resistance in that area. With the endophyte, one of the things that I've often recommended is if you have a situation where you have a pond or lakes and you have a goose problem, I will often recommend to people to grow tall fescue for a couple of reasons. First, that endophyte that makes livestock and other grazing animals sick, I believe, will also deter geese. It will equally make them sick. So they'll avoid those areas. And the other thing is, if you can allow the grass to grow a little bit longer, geese don't really like high cut grass. So if you let it go like more of like a natural tall fescue, that can, like a natural stand, like a lynx type or naturalized area, that can really help deter the geese. Sorry. They don't like they don't like living or foraging in those kinds of areas. So keep that in mind, because it could be a good management trick for geese. And between the endophyte, and they also can tend to be a little irritating. I think that if an animal is prone to sensitivity to grass or grass allergies, or they have skin conditions of any kind, tall fescue tends to be more irritating than other grasses, so keep that in mind. Winter dormancy, again, can make tall fescue lawns much less attractive in the winter. It can be overcome, though, by blending or interseeding Kentucky bluegrass or perennial rye. Blue fescue combos work well for many low maintenance athletic fields, because again, you have the combination of that deep rooting and that tough crown on tall fescue and the deep rooting. But then you also have that quick healing and repair and that weaving, stitching, advantage of putting the blue in there. I would recommend going with a 90 tall fescue, 10 blue, or like a 95-5 tall fescue blue blend if you're going to do it at seeding. The way I did it at my house is the first year I grew in the tall fescue, and then the following August I went in and I back seeded the Kentucky blue into it. It gave me a very, very nice, even, uniform texture on the lawn. But I do think that you could accomplish that doing like a 90-10 or a 95-5. Not a real fan of mixing ryegrass with tall fescue. You can do it, but they just don't get along well. Another nice thing about tall fescue is it will tolerate surprisingly low height of cut. So you can actually cut it under 2.5 inches. And the thing is, if you remember earlier on, I mentioned that tall fescue, even the continental types, will push rhizomes if they're under intensely maintained conditions. So if you're stressing it out by mowing it at a lower height of cut, you're actually going to promote that tillering, and you're going to promote the rhizome growth, and you're actually going to increase the density and reduce the blade width. So this is something that I mentioned to people. This is a little bit of a management tip here, that when you're growing tall fescue, if you have a client that is complaining about the blade of grass being too wide, or maybe it's just got a kind of a coarser, less dense texture, try dropping the height of cut. I would keep it up when you're trying to grow it in the first year or two, but once it's established, why not try dropping that height of cut below 2.5 inches and see what happens? Because it could significantly improve the quality and the density and the texture of that lawn. It is relatively shade tolerant, and this is another thing that makes me like about it, because you can use this in a shade environment. It, again, won't tolerate deep shade, but it's pretty comparable, actually, to fine fescue. And, if for whatever reason you're not a fan of fine fescue, tall fescue can be an excellent choice in a shaded environment, and it will do very well. The other thing about it is because it has that real thick, deeply rooted root system, it will stave off the trees and other plant material, because, keep in mind, even in a shaded setting, even though it's not getting that glaring sun, you still have a lot of competition going on for resources, especially with the trees. And between the two, especially in a dry year, the tree's going to win, okay? But tall fescue actually stands up really, really well in these kind of environments. So I'm thinking a place like, say, Shaker Heights or Bay Village, where you've got a lot of these old growth tree, tall oak stands, and you have these older lawns underneath these tall, so it's relatively open underneath the tree canopy. But you just can't get a lot of grass to grow in there because those trees are so well established. Tall fescue could really be your friend in that situation. And I have successfully grown in some lawns with clients using tall fescue in those situations. In a blue rye lawn, it can be a nuisance. Okay, friend or foe, right? All these grasses, depending on your vantage point, could be friend or foe. Tall fescue is no different. It can be an unwanted house guest in your lawn, and it can create undesirable patches in lawns that really can only be killed with a non-selective herbicide or physically removed. So that's the only way you're going to get it out of there. It's fine if you grow it, from its inception that way, but again, you can get contamination, and usually the most common contamination that I see in a lawn is what I would call like a fawn or a K31, more of your forage type, wide bladed, your DOT type tall fescues. Those are usually the ones that when I see them in a lawn setting, they're the ones that are giving us problems. But keep in mind that when you're growing tall fescue in a higher height setting, if you do get a tall fescue plant growing and forming a clump, it's going to form a very thick, dense clump in that lawn. And at a higher height of cut, it is going to revert back to that wider blade texture. So, if you are running into it, before we start going crazy trying to kill off everything, make little Dalmatian dead patches all over the yard, maybe suggest or maybe try, dropping that height of cut on the lawn to see if that maybe helps improve the texture. So just a thought there. Creeping bent. How could I forget about creeping bent? Creeping bent grass. So Agrostis stolonifera. This is mainly used on your golf courses, your putting greens, tees. Sometimes you'll see all bent courses where the fairway and everything is all bent grass. Not too common, but there are some. It has a rolled vernation. It has a membranous ligule that is very long and kind of tapered, so you can see how it's kind of tapered there. It's not frayed. It's just more of kind of like tapered in, as it comes to that point, but very long. It has no auricles. And that collar region will vary depending on the variety. So the collar region's not going to be a very good indicator of it. This will, with this ligule, and the leaf blade is very flat with evenly spaced veins. The color is very light, so think of like a very, almost think of like a blue-green, like a silver color, almost like a blue spruce. A lot of times if you see contamination in a lawn setting, this is what it's going to look like. It's going to have that very, very light silver blue color, lighter than a Kentucky bluegrass. The patches in the lawn are easily seen by the heavy dew on them in the morning. So this is really common early in the morning on bent grass that you see this dew all over. It has a fibrous root system, comparable to bluegrass, ryegrass. It does actually root pretty deeply. Not as deep as like a tall fescue, but it does have the ability to root pretty deeply, even though you're keeping it, you can see here, you're keeping it mowed at an extremely low height of cut. You can have a root system. You can see here's roots down here. So that's several inches down through that profile. It does have the ability to root relatively deeply. It does have a white or silver colored panicle. So kind of similar to like a bluegrass, it has that panicle. It spreads very, very aggressively by stolon and by seed. So it's a common contaminant that I see in home lawns. It's pretty much rearing up everywhere. You don't necessarily have to be near a golf course to see this, although if you do have properties that are near golf courses, you will see this growing all over in the lawns. Obviously one of the key diagnostic indicators when you come across it is a stolon. Again, the rough stock bluegrass is going to have that folded vernation. This is going to be rolled. You can tell by the ligule it is tapered versus coming to more of a point. And that color is usually a dead giveaway between, say, Poitrive and Creeping Red Fescue. It's going to have that blue-green color to it, almost like a silver blue color to it. It actively grows in summer when other grasses tend to go dormant. So this is kind of an interesting thing. It's a C3 grass, okay? It's a cool season grass, but it actually doesn't mind the warmer temperatures. So almost kind of like a warm season grass, it can really come in and go to town in the summer months. It does tend to go dormant in the winter, especially when it's in a less maintained. So this would be, your winter cooler weather. Here again, coming out of wintertime in the spring, you tend to see a lot of dormancy with it. So sometimes people think, oh, I must have like Bermuda or zoysia or something. It's like, no, it's just bent grass. It tolerates extremely low mowing heights, down to less than a 1/4 inch. That's why it is so predominantly used on like really tightly cut athletic fields. So like think a tennis green or a lawn bowling green, obviously putting greens and tees on a golf course. So it really is very, very well suited for that. You can see just how low a height of cut you can achieve with it. It prefers full sun, but it tolerates some shade. Again, down to 4 to 6 hours of sun. So kind of like Kentucky bluegrass, it'll tolerate it. So if you have shaded fairways, shaded greens, sometimes you'll have a whole golf course where, most of your fairways are ryegrass, but then, you have a few where they're nestled back in some tree lines or something where they're more shaded. They might convert that one all bent because it'll just do better in the shade. Um, it really needs to be mowed low, less than an inch, and it really needs to be mowed with a reel mower versus a rotary mower in order to look good. So you can kind of see here, in a collar region where it has crept into or is growing into that collar with that higher height of cut, and it just doesn't look as good in a high cut setting. It's very maintenance intensive from a lawn standpoint, requires a lot of irrigation, fertility, disease and insect control. This actually is from Shaker Heights. So at one point in time, there were a lot of bentgrass lawns because it was a status symbol. I mean, to think that you could have a bentgrass lawn, because they are not easy or cheap to maintain. So, back when a lot of these homes were put in, they were put in with bentgrass lawns because it was a status symbol. We just don't see too many of them anymore. There's a few of them still left over there. Most of them have been converted over. And again, most have converted the fairways over to perennial rye too for that reason. It's just too resource and labor intensive to maintain. But and sometime if you're driving over in that Shaker Heights, Cleveland Heights area, go check it out. You might see a few of these bentgrass lawns still over there. There's a few, not many. Usually only 2.5 to 5 acres of a golf course is creeping bent, and that's primarily on your greens and tees. So, if you had a 110 acre course, you might only have at most maybe 5 acres of that entire course that's creeping bentgrass. So, but, the 90% of your maintenance expense is tied to 5% or so of the acreage. So it's just kind of funny how that works out. I mean, obviously the main game is played on the greens and the tees. So, you're not going to be too overly concerned about the fairways. You got to fill that void with something. And they're usually not, most of the budget does not go into fairways. It goes into the greens and tees. Almost all of the money that is spent on a golf course is spent on the greens and tees. Very little is left over usually, especially on public and municipal courses. There usually is not a whole lot left over in the budget for your fairways. It's susceptible to a lot of diseases, so this kind of plays into why it is so resource intensive. Dollar spot, Pythium, and anthracnose can all be really, really devastating to bentgrass, especially anthracnose. You can go into something called anthracnose basal rot. Unless you're on a golf course, this is a good example here. This would be you can see this is actually a bentgrass approach. And then you would have your, cool season, predominantly perennial ryegrass, fairway area here, near the approach. And, so anyways, you can see all of the bentgrass, contamination in these areas. And, golf course is fine with it. They're going to deal with it. They're not going to really worry about it. But imagine if this was your home lawn, you're probably not going to be too happy. It can be easily spread from seed. It can also, the seed is very, very fine. It can easily drift in wind. Typically on a golf course or in most settings, you're not seeing a lot of seeding going on because they are maintaining it at such a low height of cut. It's never going to go to seed. But if you do have it escape at all into other areas like your roughs, if you have, maybe an old abandoned golf course where it's left to go back to nature, you can start getting seed produced. And so it can very easily spread from seed. But the other way that it spreads is by stolons. It can also spread from animals like geese. So geese can pick up these stolons as they're eating it and then poop them out all over a lawn somewhere in Northeast Ohio. Next thing you know, you got a bentgrass plant that survived in there, and you got bentgrass all over the place. It can also spread from equipment, so mowing equipment, especially in a higher cut turf setting where you're mowing off the ends of those stolons and the stolons get stuck in there in the deck somewhere and redeposited somewhere else. You can also get it from aeration equipment. So as you're pulling cores off a lawn, you can get those aerators with those cores spreading it all over, and you can spread it from lawn to lawn that way. The benefit or the ace in the hole for bentgrass is it can be selectively controlled with an active ingredient called mesotrione, which is known by the trade name of Tenacity. And this actually, looking in this picture here, this actually is a lawn that has been sprayed with Tenacity or mesotrione, and you can see how the grass is actually bleaching out or turning that white color. That is how this active ingredient works. We'll talk about a little bit later in the herbicides portion, but this is the one ace in the hole that we've had come on probably in the last 10 years that we can actually go out with this product, Tenacity or mesotrione, that we can kill it. You do want to spray the whole thing in entirety. It does require multiple applications, and you may have to do it over multiple years, but it is actually possible to eradicate bent grass out of a lawn. So you don't be afraid. You don't have to necessarily go in and kill off an entire area in order to get rid of it. And why would we want to do that? Well, because again, when you are mowing it with a rotary mower, when you have higher cut turf in a lawn setting, it just looks like crap. Okay. And this is really, really common. One area you can go check this out, and if you're in the area, is a place called Avon Commons up in Avon. You go drive through there sometime in season, and you'll see all these frosty, like tufty white, just looks like, you'd swear whoever is in there mowing it's doing a really, really bad job. And unfortunately, they're not. It's just because when you have bent grass growing in this high cut setting, it tends to kind of stem up, because again, it has these stolons, so it wants to grow up and out and crowd out the rest of the grass. So as it's growing up and these stolons are growing a little bit upward, you're coming in and shearing it off with the mower every week. And what ends up happening is you get these like tufts. It's almost this really like tufty appearance of the bent grass in that lawn. So again, we can come in with mesotrione and alleviate this problem and probably greatly improve the aesthetics of that lawn. I think we're going to wrap up there, and this is going to get us into the warm season, or start moving into that warm season discussion. So we'll wrap it up here, and this pretty much does all of our cool season grasses.